Could one suit of armor cost more than a house? Surprisingly, for some knights, the answer is yes. But that's not the most shocking part. The real surprise is who actually paid for it. Pop culture has fed us a glittering lie. We imagine every single dude holding a pointy stick was encased in impenetrable steel, like the entire Middle Ages was just a bunch of billionaires throwing hands. It's like assuming every modern soldier rolls up to the front line in a custom Bugatti. Spoiler alert, they don't. And neither did medieval armies. The myth insists you had to empty your life savings just to avoid getting stabbed. So, if armor was so unfathomably expensive, how did massive armies actually gear up for war? The truth is, medieval armor was a vast, layered market, ranging from cheap, sweaty padding that smelled like onions
to elite, custom-fitted steel harnesses made by absolute masters. Armor functioned less like a quick shopping trip and more like generational wealth. It was an investment, sometimes a little bloodstained, sure, but an investment. Let's strip off the Hollywood shine and look at the actual receipts. If you watch any historical blockbuster, you'd think medieval kings ordered armor like fast food. Yeah, give me 10,000 matching suits of plate. Extra shiny. And boom, the movie shows a perfectly uniform army marching in lockstep. Every single dude looking like an identical silver toaster. But in reality, warfare was the ultimate manifestation of economic inequality. There were no standard-issue military uniforms in the Middle Ages. You didn't just line up at the quartermaster and get a perfectly fitted helmet. You brought what you could afford. And if you were a peasant drafted into a lord's levy, congratulations, your impenetrable armor was a thick shirt. Maybe an iron skull cap if you were feeling particularly wealthy that year. The battlefield wasn't a pristine line of identical silver warriors. It was a chaotic fashion show of extreme poverty clashing with extreme wealth. Imagine a modern war zone where one guy drives a heavily armored tank and the 10 guys behind him are riding skateboards and holding kitchen knives. That's the real medieval aesthetic Hollywood is too scared to show you. Because seeing a lord in custom armor absolutely wrecking a guy in a cheap jacket kinda ruins the romantic chivalry vibe, doesn't it? So if the average foot soldier wasn't wearing custom steel, what was protecting him? Meet the gambeson, the medieval equivalent of a tactical mattress. It was basically 10 to 30 layers of tightly woven linen stitched together. Imagine wearing 15 thick winter coats at the exact same time, in July. It only cost a few days or weeks of labor, making it the go-to budget defense. But don't laugh, this stuff was essentially the Kevlar of the Middle Ages. Those dense layers of cloth were surprisingly good at absorbing the impact of a sword slash. Now if you wanted an upgrade, you'd look at chainmail. But a good mail shirt required linking and riveting tens of thousands of tiny iron rings by hand, meaning the price skyrocketed way out of reach for your average turnip farmer. So the stuffed jacket remained the absolute backbone of infantry armies. To protect their heads, they might throw on a cheap iron kettle hat, which, yes, looks exactly like an upside-down soup bowl. You just had to pray the guy swinging the axe aimed for the bowl, and not your arms, legs, face, or anywhere else. This was the gritty reality for about 90% of the people dying on the battlefield. Sweaty, uncomfortable, smelling like wet dog, and aggressively unshiny. Because dropping a decade of wages on a custom steel suit just wasn't happening. But what about the peak of medieval fashion? The full-plate harness. This was the ultimate 15th century flex, completely enclosing a man in custom-fitted steel. Let's crunch the historical numbers for late 15th century England. A skilled laborer made about 2 to 5 pounds for a whole year of work. And no, that's not weight, that's currency. A standard high-quality suit of custom plate? That ran anywhere from 8 to 20 pounds. Doing the math, that is up to 4 to 10 years of a skilled worker's entire salary, assuming he never ate, paid rent, or bought a single turnip during that decade. People love trying to convert these medieval prices into modern dollars, but that completely oversimplifies historical economics. In a world where a bad harvest meant actual starvation, Spending 20 pounds on metal pants was astronomical. It's the equivalent of a medieval baker casually purchasing a private jet. So, the average guy was absolutely not buying this. This was the exclusive playground of the 1%, the dukes, the earls, and the kings. For them, a full harness functioned as both military equipment and a wearable bank account. You weren't just protecting your vital organs, you were aggressively flexing your net worth. Literally walking onto the battlefield screaming, "I am statistically too rich to die." But why exactly did a few sheets of steel cost as much as a small village? Making a full suit of plate wasn't just a guy hitting an anvil until a breastplate fell out. It required hundreds of hours of highly specialized, intensive labor. The absolute epicenters of this high-tech industry were Milan in Italy and Augsburg in Germany. Think of them as the Ferrari and Porsche factories of the Middle Ages. The master armorers there weren't just blacksmiths, they were engineers, metallurgists, and tailors. They had to slope and flute the steel perfectly to deflect arrows and lances. Because catching a warhammer straight to a flat chess piece is a great way to turn your ribs into powder. Every single plate had to be custom fitted to the exact measurements of the noble paying for it. And it had to articulate flawlessly. A knight needed to ride, run, and swing a sword. If your arm gets stuck because the metal pinches your elbow, you die. Creating this wearable exoskeleton required a massive supply chain, not to mention the polishing team, who spent weeks making the steel shiny enough to resist rust. These master armorers were so famous, they stamped their work with maker's marks, just like designer brands today. Oh, you're wearing local blacksmith armor? How cute. Mine is imported from Milan. So when you paid those 20 pounds, you were funding a massive team of elite specialists. It was the absolute pinnacle of human engineering at the time. But if a suit of plate was the equivalent of a supercar, and most people couldn't afford a bicycle, where did all the slightly used armor come from? If regular folks were scrounging for scraps, who was buying the shiny stuff in bulk? Enter the original sugar daddies of the battlefield, kings and ultra-rich nobles. To feel the cohesive guard, monarchs would simply buy mid-tier armor in bulk, essentially acting as a massive medieval Kickstarter, but the reward tier was not dying. Wealthy cities and trade guilds did the exact same thing, keeping public armories for their local militias. It was exactly like checking a book out of the public library, except the late fee was getting brutally stabbed by a French knight. And when the campaign was over, you had to return the gear to the quartermaster, preferably without a giant hole in the chest, or they deduct the damage from your pay. This structure basically turns the entire Middle Ages into the ultimate pay-to-win video game server. The free-to-play user spawns in with a linen shirt, 0 buffs, and a farming implement, while the premium user, the literal duke, drops in wearing the top-tier DLC armor. He gets the armored horse mount, the squire healing buffs, and complete immunity to low-level peasant attacks. So, back to the big question, did medieval armor really cost as much as a modern house? If we're talking about the bespoke, custom Milanese full plate for the top 1%, absolutely. That was a bespoke luxury vehicle, a status symbol that just happened to stop speeding swords. But for the vast 99% of people actually fighting in the mud, they survived on affordable layers of cloth, iron hats, and dead men's hand-me-downs. So, the final verdict on the $1 million armor myth? The concept that every single soldier bought a custom steel suit is pure Hollywood fantasy. Armor wasn't a single universal price tag, it was a brutal economic pyramid, with 1 million muddy peasants shivering in cheap stuffed cloth at the very bottom, and a tiny handful of shining billionaires at the top, strutting around like impenetrable walking fortresses. It was a complex system of royal sponsorship, family inheritance, and aggressive grave robbing. But just as this bespoke custom steel industry reached its absolute peak of perfection, something absolutely horrifying happened to the 1%. The ultimate equalizer dropped onto the medieval server. It didn't care about your custom Milanese fluting or your vast generational wealth. Some completely illiterate farmer with a cheap iron tube could suddenly punch a hole straight through your bank account. Because the tiny lead ball traveling at supersonic speeds respects absolutely no one. The introduction of gunpowder completely shattered the pay-to-win meta of medieval combat. Master armorers tried making the steel thicker and heavier to stop the bullets, until eventually, wearing 40 kilos of iron just wasn't worth the severe back pain. The glorious walking tanks of the battlefield were forced into an embarrassing early retirement. But how exactly did a primitive boomstick dismantle centuries of untouchable knightly supremacy? Tomorrow, why did knights stop wearing armor? Subscribe to uncover the next historical myth.